Okay, can you hear me well? Okay, great. Let me just say a couple words before I will read the text. I'm actually will not be giving the teaching I planned on doing when I told Jakob like 3 or 4 months ago that I want to give a teaching about the American Revolution. It will still be about the American Revolution in Europe, but I wanted to talk about the 20th century, about the European Union, about progressivism, Wilson, Lenin, stuff like that. But now I don't really have a fully fledged teaching. It will just be, I will try to like show the lineages between the American Revolution and the European revolutions throughout the 18th and the 19th century, and what it meant for the left in Europe, and then I hope we may have a discussion afterwards about what all of this might mean today. Yeah, right. So it will, even though it's not a full teaching, it's still very long, because there's this old joke, I think it's from Blaise Pascal or Voltaire, I don't know exactly, where he wrote a really long letter to a friend, and in the end of the letter he says, "I'm so sorry that the letter turned out so long. If I had more time to write it, it would have been much shorter." So yeah, my plans were kind of different in summer, so. But it's going to be around 50 minutes. I think it's all right. I hope we can have a long discussion afterwards. Let me begin with a quote by de Lafayette, who was called the benefactor of two worlds by Condorcet, for example. And I quote him: "Liberty will ultimately be established in the old as well as in the new world, and that then the history of our revolutions will put all things and all persons in their proper places." And I have a second quote from Goethe, which is, "Amerika ist hier oder nirgends." America is here or nowhere. Okay. Sorry, I'm a bit sick, so my pronunciation is even worse. While the left is dead, history isn't. Right now, major political changes are happening as the crisis of bourgeois society and capitalism is still unfolding. Capitalism is still revolutionizing itself. But great parts of the left don't seem to say much about that change. Maybe they don't say much interesting stuff sometimes about that change. Maybe just don't have much to do with it. Like, I recall a panel from Portland a couple of weeks or a month ago, where, like, the first half, there was a discussion about Palestine. The topic of the panel was neoliberalism. So that's maybe something to think about, like how this change in neoliberalism is addressed right now or not addressed. So the left has to kind of retreats into a regressive narcissism that cannot really deal with reality. And thus, because the left, of which we are only a part, seems to be detached from the present, it makes us, platypus, or me, retreat into past history. Right? Like, I feel like I wanted to go into this history of the American Revolution, which I didn't know much about before the summer, when I started reading a lot about it together with James Wan. Because there's so much change happening under the concepts of still the same concepts that that were kind of brought up to the surface in the bourgeois revolutions, and now are kind of distorted and in crisis still. But we still have the same concepts. So, and the left doesn't say much about it. The left, I don't know, kind of feels not so interesting right now. So this is kind of a symptom of also other platypus members just going into history. Let's just talk about the bourgeois revolutions, because it seems to be more interesting, even more even closer to the present than anything else that happened afterwards through Marxism or the 20th century. So the major shift in world capitalism through Trump raises the issue of democracy and the EU constitution. Just to give an example, maybe as Trump manages to push Europe towards more military spending, the new task of building an EU military maybe poses the question of constitutional authority in the EU. Should the authority over the military go to the Commission or the Council? That is, to the Federal Union, or if we want to call it federal, or the member states. Recently, German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, whose political career was essentially formed through the EU and transatlanticism, now seems to take up the fight against European centralism, at least in his rhetoric. And also, of course, you know, we can talk about Varoufakis, maybe, and done some interesting stuff, maybe like the anti-Troika Zizek, who wrote this text about MAGA, make Europe great again, in the face of, you know, Trumpist fascism. Now we have to have a unified Europe, or Varoufakis saying, you know, we kind of have to deal with China more since this transatlantic alliance kind of breaks down. So it's, you know, there's all these questions. And when Trump is rearranging global trade for bringing back jobs to the American workers, when he promises to go against the American deep state, a non-elected political bureaucratic aristocracy, striking with all Lockean prerogative power of the executive, like when we take him at face value, is he not just at least appealing to the bourgeois ideals of someone like Locke or Smith, that is emancipation of the broad masses of the population through labor? When people see leftists tear down statues of the founders, what do they see attacked? The concrete institutions of patriarchy and slavery that existed in 1776, or the ideals of freedom, equality, and the pursuit of happiness expressed through 1776? You know, Trump says the fascist woke mob is endangering the revolution, and of course also Biden and Harris invoked the legacy of the revolution against the fascists. Then, when Merz or Bardella or Meloni attacked the EU Commission, are they not just repeating the very idea of popular sovereignty through state democracy against an institution that seems to be utterly detached from the will of the people? Also, Merz says what we want to do is, and I kind of translate it like he's saying, wir machen Politik für die Breite der Gesellschaft, nicht für ein paar linksgrüne Spinner. Politics for the whole society, not for some left and green maniacs. So what does the left has to do with this? In August 2016, Platypus held a panel on left exit or no Brexit, and there Neil Davenport stated the power of the people, popular sovereignty, which for him in England is provided through the House of Commons, is opposed by, and I quote him, the undemocratic forces standing against popular sovereignty, which for him is the Crown, the House of Lords, and the EU Commission. The second panelist, Mike McNair, who's here, and I hope I interpret you correctly, unlike most leftist organizations in England, was not for a left exit, since there could be no popular sovereignty in capitalism, at least not on a national level. Parting from the EU, Britain would kind of lose an alliance with the US or get into like economic troubles, which might be an economic disaster, undermining any popular sovereignty. I feel like a lot has changed since then. Mike says, steps toward an alternative need to be taken at least on a European scale, possibly larger than that. So Mike McNair and the third panelist, Gary Downing, accused Davenport of Stalinism when he invokes the concept of popular sovereignty or national sovereignty, because it points to a national way to socialism, or expresses just a reactionary populist sentiment of the right-wing UKIP. Davenport rejoins by accusing the others of dismissing the will of the people. And I think all three panelists kind of have a point. All that is to say, In the face of major changes in capitalism, the old question of how political power can be subjected to the people and all the terms and concepts alongside it become very urgent. And as expressed on the Brexit panel, they seem to pose the question of Marxism, of Stalinism, of socialism in one country, and working class internationalism, and how this should relate to the people. So the crisis of neoliberalism presents itself as a crisis of democracy, and again raises the issue of unelected aristocracy, the deep state, tech oligarchy, or the Eurocrat commissioners against the people, or the working class, or democracy. Just a couple days ago, I started listening to an interview of the German Jacobin podcast with Caroline Amlinger, who sees herself in the tradition of the Frankfurt School, and it was about her new book, which is about democratic fascism. So all the right-wingers she interviewed understand themselves as Democrats, as small d Democrats, not right-wingers. They think they want to save democracy, right? And now it's like, what is that? It's democratic fascism. So let me go back into history to get at these concepts. This conceptual distinction between aristocracy and democracy really manifests in the political revolutions of the second half of the 18th century. And to make this clear, maybe right away, when I talk about democracy here in the 18th century, I don't mean, and they most of the time not mean, and never essentially mean, progressive democracy as we have today, but what they mean is government being subject to the will of the people. And, understanding the concept like that, a monarchy could be understood as democratic, could be conceptualized as democratic, as a lot of them did. The concepts of democracy and aristocracy are phenomena of society becoming conscious of the radical change that happened through the bourgeois revolution beginning in the 14th, or the 15th, 16th century, and the inadequacy of the existing institutions to that social change. The center of human wealth and development had become free trade, free labor, free exchange of knowledge, the cities, the development of a civil society in which the freedom of the individual emerges as a function of the freedom of society and vice versa. And Smith, in The Wealth of Nations, 1776, argues that in the British colonies, this development could unfold more naturally, meaning more adequate to free human nature, in part because no feudal system had existed there. He acknowledged the horrific ills of slavery, but thought, just like feudal servitude, it would die out naturally since slave labor could not compete with free labor. Already in the English revolutions of the 17th century, this transformation, the emergence of society, found a political expression through ultimately binding the power of the crown to society through parliament in the Glorious Revolution of 1688. The Glorious Revolution gave birth to the thought of John Locke, who bases the ultimate human right on property acquired through labor, making government subject to commercial society. American colonists saw their freedom as grounded in their very rights as Englishmen. The English state or the English constitution became a role model for bourgeois thinkers on the European continent, most prominently Montesquieu, and they saw it as the most adequate political expression of society at the time. But the 7 Years' War brought not only this constitution, but also many other governments in the transatlantic world into crisis, causing a reconceptualization of their political institutions. Huge budget holes necessitated constitutional changes in order to raise taxes by Louis XV in France, Maria Theresa in Austria, or the British Empire through the stamp tax in the American colonies. Here in 1765, some of the first radical pamphlets were written like John Adams' dissertation on the canon of feudal law, in which he denounces the stamp tax because it taxes the colonies without them having any representation in the parliament, a tax that is supposed to pay for a standing army stationed in the colonies, that again was only controlled by this parliament on the other side of the Atlantic, in which no American Englishman had any say. The tax was then levied by bureaucrats, again only subject to this faraway government, and on top of that, they were taxing paper, the basis of what was called the empire of letters, the free fluctuation of debate, opinion, and education through a free press. Adams wrote that the English government, by virtue of that tax, made the first step to reintroducing, and I quote him, the inequalities and dependencies of the feudal system. Adams says, liberty cannot be preserved without a general knowledge among the people who have a right from the frame of their nature to knowledge. But besides this, they have a right, an indisputable, unalienable, and indefeasible divine right to that most dreaded and envied kind of knowledge, I mean of the characters and conduct of their rulers. Rulers are no more than attorneys, agents, and trustees of the people. That's the end of the quote. And here in these writings, he refers more than once to Rousseau's contrat social, the social compact or contract, to ground his arguments. The criticism of the stamp tax and all following measures led in turn to a critique of Parliament on the British Isle, namely through the English reform movement, which became stronger and more radical. The English reformers, names like Richard Price or John Cartwright, and the American radicals had the same ideological origins. Thinkers of the English revolutions and the Commonwealth period, and both movements were of major influence for each other. The English reformers did not consider the Glorious Revolution fulfilled. They insisted it must be advanced through further political reform. In order for government to really represent the will of the people, they called for adult manhood suffrage, equally distributed representatives, full freedom of the press to criticize the government, ultimately a further strengthening of the lower house. And all of their books and pamphlets with all these demands circulated rapidly in the colonies together with all the European radical bourgeois thought from the continent. And in an American society where there was no nobility and property was more equally distributed, these ideas became radicalized and put into action over the course of the revolution. And this in turn had huge influence back on the English reformers. So, as the Americans, in their zeal to only reconstitute their rights as Englishmen, the conflict between the Parliament and the colonies became more and more severe. This, coinciding with the English radicals' reform attempts, created conflict in the British government, which now acted more chaotic. Like from the Stamp Act of 65 until 1776, they were tumbling from one government crisis into the next, basically. Changed prime ministers like very often. In 1776, the Americans, to preserve and advance their liberty, saw no other way than splitting from the empire in order to constitute a wholly new government from scratch. Sorry. In the same year, British reformer John Wilkes formulated the first reform bill. The reformers were in close communication with the revolutionaries. John Cartwright refused to fight in the British army against the Americans and wrote pamphlets, one of which basically already formulated the 6 demands that would later become the People's Charter of the Chartists, who were so central for Marxism. I will say more about that later. So, yeah, the Independence War not only states a powerful idea, but also aggravated the financial and political difficulties in England, and Ireland, and Holland, and France. This led to the climax and failure of the early movement for parliamentary reform in England, the disturbances in Ireland leading to Grattan's Parliament in 1782, the revolution among the Dutch, the reform programs of Necker and Calonne, and the beginnings of revolution in France, and generally an awakening of political consciousness throughout the rest of Europe. The American radicals themselves understood the revolution not just as national, and I quote Thomas Paine, "The cause of America is in a great measure the cause of all mankind." Many Europeans who fought in the war on the side of the Americans would take their ideas, their spirit back to the continent, most prominently the Marquis de Lafayette. This very young French Marquis Lafayette went to America to fight against the British, and under the leadership and fatherly mentorship of George Washington, he became deeply invested in the ideals of America. And he became an abolitionist, and later, together with the French Americanophile revolutionaries Brissot and Condorcet, he would found the first anti-slavery society in Paris, inspired by the world's first anti-slavery society founded in Boston, 1776, I think. I'm not sure, around that time. This Lafayette would become a central figure in the French Revolution, and together with Jefferson drafts Droits de l'homme, so the Declaration of Human Rights in France. And there, where many in Europe who saw in it a lesson and encouragement for mankind, it proved that the liberal ideas of the Enlightenment might be put into practice. But the Americans not only put these European ideas of the Enlightenment into practice, but advanced and radicalized them. Through 1788, through the 1788 Constitution, they showed that a great modern nation-state republic was possible, not just at the size of a small city-state. They laid the groundwork for the division of powers as we know it now, and because there was no crown or nobility different from the people who could check and balance each other, they had to come up with a whole new mechanics of division of powers. And all of this showed that the ideas of the rights of man and the social contract of liberty and equality, of popular sovereignty, freedom of speech, and deliberately contrived written constitutions need not remain in the realm of speculation, but could be made the actual fabric of public life, not in a far away utopian future, but right here and right now. The culmination of this was the American Constitution of 1788, which formed, and here I quote Marx, one great democratic republic. And he goes on, whence the first Declaration of the Rights of Man was issued, and the first impulse given to the European Revolution of the 18th century. What made a profound mark on French radicals about the American Revolution was the very act of constitution making itself, the constituting of government through the principle of the people as constituent power, for the subject of government to repudiate and dismantle their government, revert to a state of nature, and then, by deliberate planning, constitute government anew, to invent and delimit new offices and authorities, and provide them with legally codified powers, was the practical acting out of the contrat social, the social contract, and the assertion of the sovereignty of society, the supremacy of we, the people. The details and ways of how society can institutionalize itself became an international discussion. Especially in France, there was broad debate about the state constitutions, the Confederacy, and the American Constitution of 1787 to 88. The controversy may be said to have begun when Benjamin Franklin gave Turgot, who was finance minister of Louis XV, I think, a copy of, no, 16th, a copy of Richard Price's observations on civil liberty. Turgot wrote a letter of praise to Price in which he nevertheless also criticized the American constitutions, and at the same time a Bliss book appeared, which John Adams responded to in the defense, and Jefferson weighed in, and together with his Italian friend Mazzei, Condorcet was agitated. A pamphlet against Adams' criticism of Mably reached Paris, where Condorcet translated it, and this pamphlet then had considerable influence in 1789. So I'm just listing a couple of things just to, that you get like an overview of, or an idea of what was happening. But, I'd love to go through the debate, but it's very broad, so it would take too much time. Essentially, it was about questions whether the legislature should be bicameral or unicameral, how much power should go to the executive, how to prevent an aristocratization, should there be a Senate or not, which checks, how many balances, and Sieyès added a part of the discussion to the third edition of his pamphlet, What is the Third Estate? So, as we can see, the discussions about the American Revolution and its constitutions were crucial for the political consciousness of the French Revolution. And from there, through the root of reason, the Napoleonic Code Civil is carried across Europe, sweeping away the remnants of feudalism such that it does not return, even in the era of Restoration. So now let me go into the crisis of society, the Industrial Revolution and capitalism. But before that, I would emphasize one crucial point once more, which is that modern bourgeois freedom is the freedom of society and not political freedom. I mean, I'm telling a political history here because that's kind of, what's at stake now or what people talk about. But, this all is essentially a question about society. And I quote Thomas Paine again, society in every state is a blessing, but government, even in its best state, is but a necessary evil. The radical bourgeois conception of popular sovereignty is essentially the idea of society governing itself, and thereby the state has to subject not only the will, I will read that again. The radical bourgeois conception of popular sovereignty is essentially the idea of society governing itself, and thereby the state has to be subject only to the will of society. But over the course of the first half of the 19th century, this will of society becomes contradictory, because the phenomena created by a new social transformation, the Industrial Revolution, rendered this will of society contradictory to the core. Free labor now seems to undermine itself. The freedom of society becomes the unfreedom of society and produces the phenomenon of unmediable class conflict. And of course, already Adam Smith knew about classes, about capitalists and workers, but in his eyes, the interest of the capitalists and their interest of the workers, or Arbeitnehmer, I don't know, were serving each other through their mutual interdependency, while now the interest of the capitalist undermines the interest of the worker, or the interest of the worker undermines his own interest. Since he works for the capitalist surplus that would interchange the worker for a better machine, the machine is basically objectified history as the accumulation of dead labor oppressing the living. And during this time, not only liberals like Tocqueville and Guizot take up the ideals of the English, the American, and the French revolutions, also this new phenomenon called socialism does. Robert Owen turns to the 1776 Declaration of Independence and calls for a radical advancement of the ideas of Washington, Franklin, and Henry. He was of central influence for the early trade unionists in England of the 1820s, and he essentially played the same role for the English. He essentially played the same role for the English as Saint-Simon for the French did, who back then, during the Independence War, fought for the Americans under Lafayette. In July 1830, the benefactor of two worlds, Lafayette, led another revolution. Lafayette, as leader of the French liberals in alliance with early French working class organizations, overthrew the Bourbon monarchy, putting an end to the Restoration period. And Bazard, who was the leader of the Saint-Simonians, who were basically radical students, he went to his old friend Lafayette and kind of said, "Look, Lafayette, this is my communist program. If you want to be if you would be a communist dictator, we will support you." And Lafayette just stared at him, didn't know what to do with that. Like Lafayette thought, of course, like the French people, they want a constitution, they want a Declaration of Human Rights. But he thought, if we bring back the Republic, there will be foreign war against us. Like this will just, bring back the memories of the Jacobins. So, what he wanted to have is a liberal monarchy, and he got it. So, motivated by these events, also in Britain, liberals pushed for reforms in alliance with the overnight trade unionists and working class organizations who pushed for universal suffrage in the spirit of the reform movement around 1776. But they weren't satisfied with the 1832 Reform Act, which would not expand the franchise to the workers. They felt betrayed by the Whigs and compared them to the Lafayettes in France, who also left the workers in dissatisfaction. The English Chartist movement grew out of this dissatisfaction with the bourgeois Whigs to become the first mass proletarian socialist movement in history, which according to Trotsky, and I quote him, is immortal in that over the course of a decade it gives us in condensed and diagrammatic form the whole gamut of proletarian struggle, from petitions in parliament to armed insurrection. All the fundamental problems of the class movement of proletariat, the interrelation between parliamentary and extra-parliamentary activity, the role of universal suffrage, trade unions and cooperation, the significance of the general strike and its relation to armed insurrection were not only crystallized out of the progress of the Chartist movement, but found their principled answer. End quote. Oh, I'm sorry. So, in 1837, the Chartists state their goal as, and I quote, to promote the moral and political condition of the working classes by disseminating the principles propagated by that great philosopher and redeemer of mankind, the immortal Thomas Paine. And they go on to carry out the grand principles of radical reform: universal suffrage, vote by ballot, annual parliaments, no property qualifications, and equal representation. These principles were already formulated by John Cartwright and the English Reform movement, motivated by the American Revolution. But now there's a major difference between the Chartists and the bourgeois radicals they refer to. While, as I argued earlier, for people like Paine or Cartwright, popular sovereignty through universal suffrage was a means for the freedom of society. Now that society and capitalism is in crisis, universal suffrage for the Chartists becomes a means for satisfying their social needs, as Marx said. The ideas of the American Revolution, of Paine and Cartwright, themselves become somewhat distorted, though behind them, masses of workers can unite to fight for nothing but their bourgeois rights. Their right to labor, their right to property, and their right to pursue their own happiness in society, not to be a subject of wage slavery. Thereby, Chartism already points to Bonapartism. Chartism does not only represent the end of bourgeois radicalism and the beginning of the mass proletarian movement for socialism, but also the demand for a democratically elected state to rule over the contradictions of society. Louis Bonaparte, after the failure of the July monarchy, elected through universal suffrage in 1848 with his coup d'etat in 1851, abolishes the parliament for the Second Republic, in order to enable himself essentially to enact welfare state programs and restore universal suffrage and ratify his Second Empire through it. With a standing army as a police force, strikes down the working class movement, all that in order to manage the crisis of society in capitalism. And I repeat one important point that in my view is often misunderstood. Democracy and popular sovereignty, by becoming a means of managing capitalism through the state, are only now to be understood as symptoms of a society in crisis, because you had bourgeois revolutionaries before capitalism who were calling for universal suffrage, like the English reformers, but they didn't understand it in that way. It was not yet this crisis. Now universal suffrage is just this means for, as Marx calls it, satisfying social needs. It's Bonapartism. And again, it is these ideas first expressed by the American Revolution which are in crisis. It's the crisis of liberalism when we look at Tocqueville, who in 1848 writes a new foreword to his famous Democracy in America, sensing the great possibility of finally constituting a liberal state in France, and look what happens. 1848, as the highest expression of the crisis of the bourgeois revolution, the bourgeoisie ceases to be revolutionary and betrays the workers, who now have to constitute themselves as an independent social and political force. But in 1848, the proletariat, according to Marx, was not yet ready, because any European revolution without England is, according to Marx, a storm in a teacup. And I quote him, "Industrial and commercial relations within each nation are governed by its intercourse with other nations and depend on its relations with the world market. But the world market is dominated by England, and England is dominated by the bourgeoisie only when the Chartists had the English government. Will the social revolution pass from the sphere of utopia to that of reality?" From 1848 on, Marx repeatedly insists on the necessity of the dictatorship of the proletariat, for which the proletariat's self-organization is a necessary condition, and Marx refuses to take part in any practical politics, which he considers a waste of time in these years of the Bonapartist counter-revolution spreading all over the globe over the 1850s. The American Civil War appears as the definite crisis of the 50s. The American founders thought of slavery as the cancer which one dares not to cut out. The cancer which one dares not to cut out at once, lest he bleed to death, with the promise, nevertheless, that the cutting may begin at the end of a given time. They trusted in the dynamic of bourgeois society, which would render unfree labor completely inefficient, making slavery wither away over time. Thus, they made a compromise with the southern slave states to get them to agree to the Union, and the Union would then, of course, intensify the bourgeois revolution. But the Industrial Revolution in Europe created an unforeseen increase in demand for cotton, which was produced by slave labor, creating the cotton kingdoms and giving the southern slaveholders economic and political power. The dead labor of European industries reanimates the slave labor of American agriculture. Thus, although the Industrial Revolution hadn't really yet taken hold of the US before 1865, America was part of world capitalism. While before the cotton boom, most slaveholders had seen slavery as a necessary evil, now the idea of slavery as being instead of an evil, and here I quote Calhoun, the staunch defender of the institution of slavery and most prominent states' rights advocates in the antebellum era, he says, instead of an evil, slavery was a positive good, the most safe and stable basis for free institutions in the world, end quote. The Southerners argued they had provided the African slaves with a lifelong security that contrasted favorably with the miserable poverty of free labor in Britain and North America. Furthermore, slave labor should be a bulwark against the class conflict arising in industrialized Europe because, as Senator Brown of Mississippi put it, slavery promotes equality among the free by dispensing with grades and castes among them and thereby preserves republican institutions, end quote. So in capitalism, the Southern idea of the republic regressed into antiquity, where freedom could only be realized as freedom from labor, which of course is also an idea of socialism, but, you know, in a completely different way, right? Which is interesting. At the same time, the rapid expansion of the US into the West made up for a historically unprecedented growth in population, in part fueled by masses of migrants from the continent, especially after, from the European continent, especially after 1848, due to the counterrevolution in the 50s. The question arose, should the new states be slave states or free states? And here popular sovereignty became a sham in the US as Stephen Douglas overturned in 1820 the Missouri Compromise, overturned the 1820 Missouri Compromise that had drawn a line between slavery and free soil. He argued that the new states should form legislatures for the people to vote on the question of slavery on their soil. The opposition of this decision gave rise to the Republican Party, with the goal to stop the expansion of slavery and ultimately abolish it altogether by waging a revolutionary war against the counter-revolution of the slaveocracy. After the Civil War broke out in '61, Lincoln initiated a sea blockade in order to hinder the Confederacy's cotton export, thereby weakening their war economy. Cotton imports plummeted in Europe, many industries stood still, which caused massive unemployment in England and France. Against their immediate economic interests, the British workers organized to hinder British interventions on the side of the Confederacy, thereby also preventing France from reconsidering their support. In 1861, Marx writes, and I quote him, Louis Bonaparte knows that the true people of England, of France, of Germany, of Europe, consider the cause of the United States as their own cause, as the cause of liberty, and that, despite all paid sophistry, they consider the soil of the United States as the free soil of the landless millions of Europe, as their land of promise, now to be defended sword in hand from the sordid grasp of the slaveholder. Louis Napoleon knows, moreover, that in France, the masses connect the fight for the maintenance of the Union with the fight for their forefathers, for the foundation of American independence, and that with them every Frenchman drawing his sword for the national government appears only to execute the bequest of Lafayette. The people of Europe know that the fight for the continuance of the Union is a fight against the continuance of slaveocracy, that in the contest of the highest form of popular self-government till now realized is giving battle to the meanest and most shameless form of man's enslaving recorded in the annals of history, end quote. So the European proletariat supporting the North was the first act of working class internationalism, as he says. As you probably all know, but I will still repeat, Marx writes in Das Kapital, I quote, as in the 18th century, the American War of Independence sounded as Tocsin, die Sturmglocke, for the European middle class. So in the 19th century, the American Civil War sounded it for the European working class, end quote. The proletariat acted against their immediate interest for the greater potential in history, which lay in the abolition of slavery and the full unfolding of capitalism in America, and generally, right, the unfolding of capitalism. And I quote Marx again, in the United States of North America, every independent movement of the workers was paralyzed so long as slavery disfigured a part of the republic. Labor cannot emancipate itself in the white skin, where in the black it is branded. But out of the death of slavery, a new life at once arose, end quote. The Civil War thereby marked the transition from more than a decade of post-1848 counterrevolution to a time of renewed political possibility. In 1867, the Reform Act, that hadn't succeeded in the 18th century reform movement, that had betrayed the workers in 1832, and now, after their movement, was emboldened again through the victory of the Union against the Confederation, enfranchised the British working class for the first time. And it was the same movement that would motivate the founding of the first International Workingmen's Association. So you now see how the strings kind of lead together, back together, the American Revolution, Lafayette, the British Reform Movement, the Chartists, Civil War, and finally the First International. And all of this is so closely connected since bourgeois society is global, and so is its crisis. The Cold War, though, introduces a certain division and opposition between the American and the French revolutions, with the Russian Revolution and the USSR supposedly following the French as opposed to the American Revolution, and it echoes through until the present. But the American and the French revolutions are continuous as part of the greater historical bourgeois revolution. The American revolutions must be rescued from the Stalinist Cold War slander, which echoed and resonated with the earlier progressive dismissal of the bourgeois revolution. And, great 20th century leftist historians like Hobsbawm or Lefebvre totally dismissed the significance of this transatlantic relation. And in order to understand properly historical Marxism's relation to the bourgeois revolution, it is best to return to its original understanding. If that cosmopolitan enlightenment project remains unfinished, it is because the course of history, since two publications of the Declaration of Human Rights in America and in France in the 18th century, failed to fulfill and indeed undermined the radical potentials of the 18th century. From a Marxist perspective, this has to be taken up again, but, the question is how. The only thing one can say, maybe, is that, any revolution in Europe, if it might appear, would be a storm in a teacup without another American revolution, just as you said, about 1848 without England. But yeah, that's kind of it. That's the teaching. Sorry, I want to leave out the last one. Yeah, I can hear you.
Why do you think there's been a successful movement to create a federal European republic? Because it doesn't seem to be thinking about the background that as structural? Is there a difference between European capitalism, or how do you explain that? The second question is your comment about Trump and the American Revolution, but one of the things that's interesting and happened very recently is that the anti-Trump protests have embraced this no king's rule.
Right.
Like, so at least rhetorically, liberals very recently in America are embracing the rhetoric of the American Revolution. Trump is pushing for etc. And then the comment is really about the relationship between the American and French Revolution, which is the topic of the next panel. So two things. One is you mentioned Lafayette, who was the hero of two worlds. So describing him as a revolutionist in America is totally correct. However, his role in France will be more ambivalent in that he was also the opponent of people to his left. And I mean, you mentioned Lafayette and Hobsbawm, I think you were unfair to him, but I think the question, or the comment I would have, I'm not sure you can comment on it, is I don't think, like, in their own time, certainly the French and American Revolution were seen as much more powerful. And there's actually like one of the interesting things, and I've talked about this a lot with James Wan, is that in Jonathan Israel's massive series of books, there's one dedicated to the French Revolution and one dedicated to the American Revolution. The one on the American Revolution and its global effects, the gathering place is quite good. And the one revolution that he really stumbles over is the French Revolution.
So, thanks for the questions. I'm not sure whether I can answer the first one. I mean, there was at least like, it's quite funny. In 2020, Ursula von der Leyen referred back to something that is called the Manifesto of Ventotene, and I think 2018 during Brexit, or after Brexit, referring to Brexit, there was, I think it was a couple of European, like, I don't know, they were in the parliament, I guess, and they formed in Ventotene some group for European federalism. I don't remember it quite well. I wish I could. I wish I could make a teaching about that, but yeah, or talk about that. And they referred to this Manifesto of Ventotene that was essentially written in Ventotene during the Second World War by a couple of socialists, Italian socialists, who were imprisoned by Mussolini, and they wrote this like manifesto on for like calling for European federalism, with the role model of the American Federalists. But you know what then happened after 45 is basically a restoration of the nation states, right, and not this like idea of and I don't exactly know why. I mean, your question was what would it have to do with capitalism in Europe being different to?
Well, you've had like Trotsky's slogan with socialism in the United States and Europe, but you could presumably have a capitalist in the United States.
Right.
I'm puzzled by the question myself.
Yeah.
There doesn't seem to be either support for it either among the European masses or among the elites.
Yeah. I mean, I think I can't answer this question. I really don't know. It's a really complex question. I mean, there is these ideas of the issue being that, you know, that kind of Europe is this like, or the EU, or the European community became this like post-imperial structure, like that, you know, was kind of dealing with the question of like, like the French colonies, for example, right? Like that, you know, you had this. I mean, it's a really hard. I will just like associate some stuff, right? That, you know, basically the US was going against the colonialism or the colonies of the Empire of France, and which, you know, made them, but also like Germany had their special interest of like kind of, you know, restoring their economy, while, you know, you had to defend yourself against, it's also caught up in the Cold War, right? So, you know, you had to have this like in-between bloc, which then at the same time, you know, wanted to kind of like constitute sovereignty, like France or then also the British, against, you know, the US trying to go against the colonies, their imperialism, their empire in a sense. But how this all relates to the question of federalism, I don't really know. I think like federalism is a, you know, it seemed like the restored nations after the Second World War were more like caught up with kind of, I don't know, like reintroducing or reestablishing their economic sovereignty. And for that, you don't really need a federal union necessarily. And then the question is why the ideas of you know, a federal Europe, like the Ventotene or early ideas of a social union, a socialist union, or a republic like a European republic like this Italian guy Mazzini considered to be a good thing. Why this idea didn't take hold of Europe? I don't know. I really don't know. It's a really good question. I don't know, I would be interested with what you would think. Do you have an idea about that?
I don't have an answer. You might understand it culturally. Different languages, different national traditions, the strength of nationalism. I mean, I remember the long time ago, Marx had an argument that you can't unify Europe with the means of Jacques Delors or the means of Adolf Hitler. I'm not sure that argument holds.
Yeah.
But that was like a kind of orthodox Marxist that the push was you can't abolish the nation state.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean
I don't necessarily buy that argument, but that was one argument.
I mean, often the argument of the European Union, why we need a federalist European Union, is then also like, you know, look at after Hitler and after, you know, European fascism, you know, that's why we built a community, European community, to, you know, for something like that never to happen again. But, you know, that's also not that's kind of what they tell. So. But it's also not quite adequate, I guess. But yeah. Sorry. Yeah, true. Sorry, what exactly was the question there? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And then the comments about how you see the links or discontinuities between the French and American revolutions. Basically, if you have any comments on that. You seem to attribute the opposition to them just to the Cold War. I'm not sure if that makes sense. But that was just, if you had any thoughts, because you commented on it.
Yeah. I mean, the No Kings movement was also like one phenomenon that made me that you know, rose interest for like going into the history of the American Revolution. You know, because it's not only, of course, the Republicans, but Democrats too would now refer to as I also said in my teaching, to the, you know, American Revolution, to liberalism against a re-established monarchy, a too strong executive, a president is basically a monarch. So that was, that motivated me to read the Federalist Papers and all of that. Like, does it have a connection, or what is the connection? Is it, you know, does it make sense? So that was definitely a motivation for me to look at it. So I mean, it's a hard. I unfortunately didn't follow the No Kings movement. I don't exactly know their arguments. If there are any, it seems to be like a, you know, I don't know. It's right.
Whereas a few years ago, like the 1619 project, liberals were just denouncing the American Revolution
sorry, the last part?
I think it's interesting as an ideological rhetorical phenomenon, just the liberals using the rhetoric of the American Revolution. That's all.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because there was a shift now. Like before that, it seemed like a lot of Democrats would reject the idea of the American Revolution. Project 1619, the New York Times, stuff like that. And now they refer more positively to it again, which is an interesting shift, maybe. That interested me. But yeah, it's kind of superficial, isn't it? I don't know, because yeah, I don't know what else to say about it actually.
Shall we move on to the next question?
Yeah.
Mike? Thanks, Steve. Very interesting talk. I have substantial experience with you about the history, but I'm not going to go into those. But you quoted me, and I think it's worth commenting. We got 2016 wrong, CPGB. We got 2016 wrong because we didn't believe that the United States was back in Brexit. We thought that the United States was opposed to Brexit because it wanted the US State Department wanted the United Kingdom as a veto power to prevent further European integration. Which it, to some extent looked like, but it turned out very rapidly after the referendum that was straightforwardly untrue. And that what Neil Davenport represents is US colonial interests in controlling Europe and in controlling Britain. The representation of that is that for these guys, Brexit will not be over until the Union is actually broken up. That's the line which they defended in the Times, Telegraph, Policy Exchange, and so on. But on the other hand, this relates back to Richard Rubin's point. You didn't mention two things. Two things which I did refer to in 2016, and one of which is that CPGB, our main point on this, was opposition to plebiscitary Bonapartism, to the use of plebiscites to purport to be the will of the people, which are in fact a will of the people defined by the asker of the question, whether it's Napoleon Bonaparte, or Louis the Napoleon, or Adolf Hitler, or Ayatollah Khomeini, or Boris Johnson, David Cameron, Boris Johnson, and so on. And our view is that the Labour group could only effectively break out of that trap by opposing openly opposing the idea of the referendum. That relates to the second thing. What we see in the States now, the judiciary are not the least dangerous branch. And that was already visible. These guys talk about the Commission as an unaccountable body, but the Commissioners are all appointees of the national governments. The Council of Ministers, they are all elected. But judicially, they don't talk, because in reality, the judiciary is an aristocratic institution, and it's an aristocratic and plutocratic defence. And in that sense, why is there no mass support for European unification? Partly because the United States has military control of the continent, and has had military control of the continent since 1945. European Union was in its interests as a means of Cold War management, as it is no longer in its interests. That's it.
I don't have much to say about that, but could you expand on the last part? I didn't quite understand why.
Yeah. Okay. Shortly, it was in the interest of the United States to have the European Union for the means of managing the concessions which were made to the working class in the purposes of the Cold
yeah, I don't know what exactly to say about that. I'm sorry, I think I cannot comment on that so much because I don't know the whole history. It's really unfortunate that was the history I would like to get into. And then there would also refer back to Richard's question that I kind of dodged, like what would it mean now, the whole question of Lafayette, or if I got to answer it, what would it mean now, the whole relation between the EU and or Europe and the US. But this whole 20th century history is it's unfortunately quite dark to me. Like I don't know much about it. As I said, I didn't get to read that unfortunately over the summer because my plans changed a lot. So I can't, as Mike, unfortunately I can't answer to your comment. But of course, the thing is, there's still, at least what I hear from the Trump administration. There was one thing about Lafayette. This is just an anecdote, but on the AI summit in Paris, beginning this year, J.D. Vance held a speech, and then the end of the speech, he kind of says he refers to Lafayette. He says Europe is important when we look at AI. He conceptualized the AI revolution as profound as the Industrial Revolution, and then he would say, but we have to defend it against nations or forces that go against the ideals of the French and the American Revolution, the ideals of Lafayette. So it's basically talking about still a united transatlantic alliance against China for the question of the AI revolution, and there he refers to Lafayette. Right, we have to advance the ideals of the French and American revolutions, and he said that he was in Paris and he could hold the sword of Lafayette, and Lafayette's sword was a weapon that could do bad. Now we have AI; it could be a weapon to do good and bad. So there's of course still a reference to we need a united transatlantic relation against whoever. At least in rhetoric, so it's still there, and there they refer to these ideals. The question is, what does it mean actually, right? Does it mean anything? It's just rhetoric. But then the question is, why would you refer to Lafayette, right? When it's, he could refer to more concrete interests. So that's maybe something I would say about it, that I found quite funny as an anecdote. This reference to Lafayette by J.D. Vance at the AI summit and the new industrial revolution through the AI revolution. So that's maybe one. I leave it at that. Maybe we can take another question or a comment.
I guess another category that I'd like to thread into the discussion that wasn't strongly present, either in the way that we discussed the type of inspiration that Constitution making in the post-revolutionary American environment had for Europeans, or for Lafayette's role in 1830. But also I think it bears on the early history of the English Revolution, or the early history of the American Revolution meeting the English Revolution, which is a question of republicanism. And obviously there are a lot of people on the left who make a great deal of this, particularly because of their desire to denigrate or sideline the legacy of liberalism, particularly as represented by a Lockean, Montesquieuian, arguably statism, monarchical project. And we talk about this, of course,
Sorry, again, a
Do
significant.
you think that there's a meaningful divide before the American revolutions and French Revolution in, shall we say, bourgeois ideology or the Enlightenment between liberals and Republicans? Because this is a claim that we are a lot of, I think, educated leftists make. But so that's my question. My view is clear. I don't think that this is a strong divide, though, of course, it's important in 17th century British history. Because the question how you understand Locke as an heir to Oliver Cromwell or not, for instance. But then there's the question of how socialism inherits the Republican project, initially in the pre-Marxian socialists, and then through the experience of the I think that those questions would reframe your focus on democracy and suffrage, which I don't think would be as important either for liberalism or republicanism before the 1830s and 40s.
So, I mean, on the question of republicanism in the American and French revolutions, I mean, as I said, this whole the discussion of republicanism was, of course, taken up by the French radicals. And then, the issue was, and there's for example an interesting text from William Vance Murray, where he argues with Mably, and Mably thought that there is a danger of aristocratization in America. Right. And then they have this argument where Vance Murray says, and Vance Murray was kind of a proto-federalist at the time at 86 when he wrote that, that there is, a social difference to a certain extent between the American colonies and France, which is that in the colonies there's no nobility, as I said, there's no crown. So, and he would argue that France is socially the colonies are more so to speak, more modern, are more bourgeois socially in a way, because they're more progressed in history, because they don't have to deal anymore with the nobility. And then, this really becomes a question in republicanism throughout the French Revolution, where they say, essentially, the question is, the division of powers. Do we have a do we have a Senate? Do we have a bicameral system? Do we have, what does the executive, and how much power goes into the executive? And in the end, of course, they had a unicameral system, because a thought was that a Senate, in a Senate, the nobility would probably take up the seats in the Senate, and the executive would be a monarch, which of course, you still had a monarchy until Czech. So there essentially was, maybe the issue of how to balance that in a society that still looks very different than in the colonies. So there was the social issue that kind of, made I guess republicanism look differently in France, while of course they took the ideas from, as I tried to explain, from the American revolutionaries. The question is, what it works in the moment, how do you, because the question is not essentially the system itself, right? But as I said, how can society govern itself? Right, the question of liberalism, it's the question of liberalism, and then the question is like how do you institute that? How do you institute society? Right. So I think it rather refers to that. Like this is essentially the question of like how society can govern itself, and then like it's not about the question of republicanism as such, but is republicanism, I guess, as a means for liberalism. I would say it like that. And also concerning Lafayette in 1830, he somewhere says that, of course, the American system, the American Republic is the best, the Constitution, the American Constitution is the most advanced Constitution you could think of. And he would like to constitute it in France in 1830. But as I mentioned shortly, this is like in the consciousnm of the European powers at the time. This is really closely connected to Jacobinism, right? Like this, and also to a lot of people in France. So he says, okay, even though like the Republic would be the most adequate system to bourgeois society, he says you can't do it right now in France, but he would constitute a monarchy, which then has basically republican institutions around it, but you can't call it like a real republic. So, and of course, he still thinks that this is essentially liberal way of constituting the French state. Yeah, sorry, Richard. Sorry. Whether that was what I was saying. Sorry, I didn't hear the question so well.
Just that you could say that one of the differences between the two revolutions is the American Revolution was Republican from the beginning, and the French Revolution became Republican through the obduracy of the monarch himself.
That's a like. I wouldn't say that necessarily, right? That the American Revolution was Republican from the start, right? I mean, that wouldn't be my argument at all. No, not at all. But it was. I mean, the Republic was or republicanism, I guess, was. Was of course in a certain way, and that's why progressives don't like the Constitution often. Like sometimes, you have this, which is taken up by the left, right? That the Constitution was a kind of a Thermidorian counter-revolution, because it took away the more immediate democracy of the state legislators that you had at the time. And then, took basically away the power from the people, so to speak, through a Senate and a strong executive. But the thing is that this actually was a consequence of basically in the 1780s what Jefferson would call a democratic despotism, right? That, for example, just to give a concrete example, a lot of smaller farmers who had a lot of debt, and they wanted to get the state legislators to get rid of the debt, right? Through democratic means, and of course, if you say, okay, you can just through democracy get rid of debt, then there could be no credit, and credit is of course really essential for economy to flourish. So for a liberal society to flourish in a way, and then you had Chase Revolution, and during Shays rebellion. I'm sorry, Shays rebellion. Against Shays rebellion, some bigger landowners suddenly, building private militaries that could, strike down this, Shays rebellion for more democracy or against debt and so on. So you had, suddenly all these excesses, you can say to a certain extent, of democracy in the 80s, against which, you need this Republican division of powers, a union through which you can preserve the liberty of society against democracy, right? That I think, and there the question of republicanism becomes really essential, and you could make a case that the French Revolution had maybe problems with, as Constant, who we read, he would make the argument, right, that France regressed into an ancient idea of republicanism, not of republicanism, of freedom, right, through a more, this immediate, democratic republic that is, not preserving the freedom of the moderns, which is freedom of society, but wants to institute a more direct, democratic, ancient freedom, which of course caused many troubles in the French Revolution. The question is, why did that happen? Which again maybe is a question of the the social outlook of France. I mean, there's I think it's Sean Quincy Adams, for example, who makes that argument that I don't know if it's right that the French Revolution was not as as smooth as the American Revolution, because the society was quite more complex there because of these more social, or because it was essentially not as socially advanced as or as Smith. I quoted Smith, who would say, in the colonies, society, a modern bourgeois society could develop more natural, and there you have to get rid of these old, feudal residues somehow in society. So it was a much harder thing to do there. So this might be a couple of of arguments maybe you can make why there was this division, or this opposition between the two revolutions that essentially were part of one big revolution still, but
I just, this is the last follow-up. This is one of the reasons why I was raising the issue of the English Revolution, because there the argument would precisely be, or a argument would be, that the parliamentary supremacy of the crown is more accurate to that social complexity, right? And that the republicanism couldn't deal with large territories, complex societies. It was an ancient form. Everything from the English Republic that needed preserving was preserved in the Glorious Revolution. This, of course, is what Montesquieu identifies modern society itself as modern in the spirit of the laws. But there's also a question of what happens in the 19th century, which I don't want to lose sight of. What happens to the language of republicanism in the age of socialism? Obviously, this is Engels' critique of the airport program, right? They don't explicitly mention the republic, right? It becomes central to the question of socialism, despite the fact that there are these republican legacies, whether sort of fake Versailles Third Republic or the ongoing American Republic in the late 19th and early 20th century. Without getting into the 20th century and these kinds of questions, already after 1840s, I think it becomes a central question for convincing what is the relationship between the socialist revolution and bourgeois revolution.
Should we move on, or do we have a short comment on that?
not necessarily. We can move on, I think. Yeah.
So thank you. So I have two questions. Thanks for teaching. And they pick up on the whole Lafayette issue and the difference or the specificity of the French Revolution. And I wanted to raise, so there's a long tradition associating Marxism with the French Revolution, like both affirmatively and critically both from the left and from the right. So that the syndicalists like Citoyen would associate Marxism with the idea of the revolutionary dictatorship, going back to Jacobinism as a sort of mistaken idea of how to overcome capitalism. There would be a right-wing criticism of Marxism, figures like Schmidt or Hannah Arendt, and they all point to Marxism's association or relations to Jacobinism specifically. And this might be related, so going to today, the issue of the American Revolution today, the French Revolution today, this might be related to the relative absence of revolutionary Marxism in England and America in the early 20th century. And I was wondering what you make of that connection, and so that would be my first question. And the second question is that, given that Lapidus is interested in historical Marxism, I find it interesting that there's so much interest in the American Revolution, but relatively a lack of interest in the French Revolution. And why do you think that is?
I mean, to first address the second question, I have to ask you again about the first question. Why in Platypus there's so much interest in the American Revolution right now? I guess it's kind of a symptom of the left itself to a certain extent that would be the first thing that as you said, the left likes to refer to the French Revolution, and thereby it's maybe necessary to go back to the American Revolution and argue for the relevance of the American Revolution, which is kind of thrown under the bus by the left and through or the left actually tailing a certain narrative of maybe a Democratic Party narrative, the New York Times 1619 Project, which is the last big accumulation of a history of throwing the American Revolution under the bus. They're saying it was never actually a revolution, but just white Americans wanting to preserve slavery, while also before the 20th century Stalinist left tailing progressivist narrative of the constitution making as being Thermidorian, reactionary. So there's kind of a need when we look at the left to go back to the American Revolution. That might be one thing. At the same time, I think for European platypus in Europe, for me, for example, the American Revolution was really not known to me that well. Of course, the Boston Tea Party and all of this stuff, but it never really comes up. Only by often, at least from leftists, I know Oliver Machat, who is political scientist and in Vienna, and Laclau Muffian, post-Marxist leftist, and he has this lecture on radical democracy, where he says the idea of radical democracy originating in the great revolutions of the 17th and 18th century, and then he would say, but the American Revolution, that was not a democratic revolution, it's an anti-democratic revolution. So it kind of poses the necessity to get into this history, and I think that's why there's kind of a big interest in platypus. And the second thing, of course, is that we have to think about the question of we kind of there's a necessity to kind of center around, of course, the U.S. concerning the global world order right now. As I said, European revolution would be a storm in a teacup, right? So there's this, of course, this necessity to kind of overcome maybe this, this kind of also this anti-imperialist, anti-American sentiment that there is not only on the left, right? And I think that's also something that motivates people to go into the American Revolution in platypus, right? And then also it's the revolution that worked out, right? We're still living to a certain extent. It's still relevant, right? You can still, refer to it, and it seems sometimes for me when I think about, what to do in politics, right? Is there something actual practical I can do? Now leaving aside platypus, then I would come with a liberal project of free speech. I don't know, referring to this whole the history of liberalism, of the American Revolution, and so on. It's all, and that's also why maybe there is a kind of tendency, in and people who are kind of who sense that the left is really dead. And to get an idea what the present would mean without thinking about the left, right? What the bourgeois radicals thought back then, and it's still actual, right? The American Constitution still exists, and to think about what that means without thinking about the left or trying to do that, right? So I think that is also something that motivates people in platypus. But what was his first question again? I'm sorry.
Do you think there's a connection between this idea that Marxism was specific to the French Revolution context and the relative absence of revolutionary Marxism in the Anglo-Saxon sphere in the early 20th century? That's an interesting question. That's a very interesting question. I mean, it was not completely absent, right? I mean, that's relatively absent. Yeah. I mean, it's and how this would, the question then would be how this relates to maybe the difference between maybe the American Revolution and the French Revolution, right? Yeah. I mean, that's one thing one would come up with is saying that in the Anglo-Saxon world, maybe the liberal project was more successful, right? So it kind of that's one argument you would hear, right? That there, the revolution succeeded. That's something and still workers in the world would. The idea of the American dream to go to America and, realize the potential of bourgeois society there, it exists like that. While, you could say that the 19th century in Europe concerning liberalism was not very, very successful to a certain extent. Which maybe poses the necessity of going beyond it more. Maybe that's something to talk about, which, it's a political question, more or less. Maybe that's a way to think about it. But I'm not really sure whether this suffices, at all, or is sufficient. Yeah.
I mean, yeah.
Sorry, Sam, I hope you'll forgive me. I'm going to maybe make some comments to try and clarify some of the things that have come up in the Q&A discussion. And I just want to start by pointing out that I think part of the question of the contribution of the American Revolution is how we receive the bourgeois revolution through the failure of the socialist revolution. Right? And the first thing any student who tries to read about the French Revolution is confronted with is that when reading the Lefebvre or Francois Furet, you're actually reading very little about the French Revolution and quite a bit about the Russian Revolution. Right? And we could say that we inherit this even now through, inflected through the left in a certain respect. Perhaps a task for us and platypus would be actually to ask, right, what the French Revolution was and what the American Revolution was. So I want to make one clarification on some of the constitutional questions that have been raised, really beginning with Richard's question about the No King's protests, right? And we could see this maybe as a way of strength for English people understanding the American Revolution through 2016. Of course, the president isn't precisely the opposite of a king. In some ways, he's an elected king. And what Marx called parliamentary Bonapartism in Britain came through actually the abrogation, right, of the constitutional role of the monarch. I think this is really, really important. In the 1688 Constitution, Glorious Revolution, created a system in which the monarch was potentially something that could be appealed to, right, in the name of the people, in the name of society, the freedom of society, against Parliament. If Karl Popper here, he would remind us that the Chartists, right, appealed to the monarch and said, well, you should dissolve this government, you should dismiss your ministers because they don't really represent, right, the people of Britain. We do, and so we should get to form a government. This also gets, we could say on the other side, the French Revolution is exactly Republican and ends in an emperor, right? There is still a question of executive power, and should we take, the kind of more Republicans to be the real representatives of the revolution as opposed to the constitutional monarchists? I think that's kind of an open question. This also should make us question what we think Marx's concept of Bonapartism was, right? Because Bonapartism for Marx is, I would say, not simply the plebiscite and the emperor, to put it one way. So parliamentary Bonapartism is the rule of the cabinet, right? And this really comes from the 1850s in England. And it's, on the one hand, the secrecy of the cabinet vis-a-vis the monarch. So the monarch not only isn't going to stop the ministers or stop the cabinet, but will not even fulfill the reporting role, right, of telling the people what it is that their government is doing, right? And in 1865, in the English Constitution, Walter Bagehot, who was very anti-Napoleon III, incredibly anti-Napoleon III, out of his hatred of Louis Bonaparte, right, wrote a constitutional theory of the English Constitution, basically to justify Palmerston's government by cabinet as superior to the American model because it combines the legislature and the executive. And so you can do way more things. You can fund programs, you can have a dictatorship, you can do X, Y, or Z in public policy without much oversight. You don't really have to tell Parliament, you don't really have to tell the monarch, and then if things get really bad, you can still try to make an appeal to the people, right, reasons people would think today for why there's not a united Europe. It's Russia on the one hand, and then it's Brexit on the other. Right, so these are kind of the two reasons anybody can on the street, and anybody maybe on the left even, we'll find out tomorrow, right, might say that there's not a united Europe. And this actually goes back in a kind of a funny way to Trotsky's writing, right, for the United States of Europe, which is from 1923, right, so it's happening in the aftermath of things like the Irish Civil War, and it's also anticipating part of the question of whether there will be a revolution in Germany. Right, and in that essay, Trotsky says that Europe is an economic unit, right? And the call for a federation in Europe is about uniting the European proletariat in the midst of mass destruction and connecting them up with Asia, with Africa, and with America. And he talks there about the two big questions, which would be the Soviet Union and Great Britain. And he says, well, the Soviet Union would probably choose to join, right, this federation. And in Great Britain, it would depend upon the course of the revolution, right? Is the revolution going to spread to Britain or not? And that in the absence of such a federation, of course, the United States would want to kind of renew Europe as a political entity for the purposes of the continuation of capitalism over and against the 1917 revolution. So I think when we're talking about, any sort of political country, these things come from wars or they come from revolution. They're objects that we inherit from history, right? And so I think the question that we are asking ourselves for Europe, about Europe, and also about America, comes to us from the resolution to the failed revolutions of the early 20th century. And America, in kind of restarting global capitalism with its relative freedom, right? And it did so not just over and above as imperialists, but because the working class moved there and works there, right? Because the working class, right, restarted capitalism in through America, the extent to which Europe became a place mostly of despotism, right? The American Constitution didn't come through that unscathed, right? And nor did the American Revolution. So I just wanted to get these things on the table for our conversation because I think they're very important. I guess I'm sorry I don't have any questions. It's rather rude of me, but
No, that's
the general idea
that's great.
is let's think about why it is we're asking these questions now.
Yeah, no, that's great. I mean, you can also make comments, as I said in the beginning, like I did not prepare to teach and I wanted to, and I have more. I mean, someone always has more questions than answers, but I don't have many answers either. So, yeah, that's why I said in the beginning, we can maybe have a discussion by the frame I just given, right? So, yeah. So you don't. So thanks, Arian. You don't have to ask a question. Yeah.
I have a question and I have a comment. So it's more of a clarification question. At your teaching where you talked about the Civil War, there's a role of the proletariat, and you said something like that the proletariats were against the British slavery and thus also the development of wealth capital. And could you maybe elaborate a little bit on the role of the proletariat in the Civil War that you just touched on?
I mean, for Marx, it was like of course it was the immediate interest, the immediate economic interest at the time of, it would have been for the British working class to actually support the British government that wanted to support the Confederacy, so basically the institution of slavery, because they were dependent on the cotton, right? While the Union made a sea blockade to hinder the export of cotton from the south in order to kind of strike on the war economy. And what has taken place then was the working class would be interested, of course, in the cotton because they lost a lot of jobs. Because industries had to stand still because they couldn't import the cotton that they needed to produce. But the the British working class was then in solidarity with the union, going against, like striking, forming a political movement to essentially go against a British involvement with the Confederacy in the Civil War, right? And this, of course, shows that for Marx, that the proletariat could overcome their immediate economic interest and think about the, so to speak, like a long-term goal of socialism, of the necessity, for example, to have for the former black slaves to become workers themselves, to become free laborers in an industry of America and an industrialization in America. This, of course, like then really took place after the Civil War, in order to advance essentially the movement for socialism, right? Which essentially goes against the immediate interest of the working class. And this, this is something you would call class consciousness, right? To the consciousness of the proletariat to advance capitalism against their immediate interests in order to come closer to socialism, to achieve socialism. And of course, for that you need the advancement, right, of capitalism, which is also, of course, an advancement of the proletarian movement for socialism that becomes, really conscious of itself by, as I already said, overcoming the immediate interest to not lose their jobs because the import of cotton stopped, right? And this for Marx is, as he says, the toxin for the possibility of international workers' movement, that would think about, their interest in that way. It's not immediate, but refers to socialism, and that's why this is an occasion for him to join the First International, right? And he writes this letter to Lincoln, where he congratulates the American people for electing Lincoln again to advance the revolution against slave labor in America. So that's essentially the connection, right? Yeah. Sorry.
My question, thank you, you mentioned at the end of the teach like Stalinism and the way it treated French and American revolutionary, that they kind of, I don't know much about it, but if you could like elaborate on that a little bit, and why there was a motivation to push like the Marxist understanding of both bourgeois revolutions.
I mean, one thing to say about it, maybe, and it will be quite superficial, is that as far as I know, there was this, the shift in the beginning of the 20th century of the American Communist Party in the context of, a popular front against fascism, right? That, before that, of course, like, FDR, New Dealism, progressivism was for, Stalinism an expression of fascism, which then changed, and you kind of had there was a growing alliance between, progressivism and like Stalinism and Marxism, right? In which I think and as the progressivists, as far as I know, I mean, there's this book from this historian Beard, who would really make the narrative that the he would still say the American Revolution was a revolution, but then there was a counter-revolution. So actually, the revolution of '76 was taken back, as I already said, through the Constitution in 1788, because it was basically a counter-revolution of a bourgeois, not in the old sense, but bourgeoisie sense, against democracy. There was a couple of federalists who then said we will take away democracy because of economic interests, because of merchant interests and thus capitalist interests against the workers or the landowner, the small farmers and stuff like that, right? So they're and this is taken up by basically by Stalinism in the U.S. And this is the narrative that you hear when you listen to panels that platypus made about the American Revolution. A lot of leftists would have this narrative. It would, in a certain sense, say that the American Revolution maybe was a revolution, but then immediately had a counter-revolution, or was no revolution at all. Or, for example, Daniel Lazare would say that it was a revolution of the Ancien Regime. It was basically like the Belgian Revolution. That would actually go against the progression in history, which was more democratization and stuff like that. So, and the second thing is, Richard, you said you wouldn't agree with that it has to do with the Cold War, where, it becomes this, caught up in this small narrative of anti-imperialism, of anti-Americanism, right? That generally, essentially, the West, expressed through the big enemy of America, is reactionary, couldn't have had this revolution as a progress in history by the French Revolution, in Jacobinism, which is then really, connected to Bolshevism, right, which some Bolsheviks did themselves, this is a revolution. This is what we understand as revolution, while the American Revolution was not a revolution in that sense. Some are caught up with, this extreme violence, with what Constant would, then call the freedom of the ancients, right? So, in a certain sense, Stalinism is, caught up in the whole question of Bonapartism, dealing with an illiberal idea of, dealing with the contradictions in society, right? Which, regresses back into a more ancient concept of, of freedom and democracy to a certain extent, right? So I guess there's this connection, but I would also, that's more superficial, I guess. I hope this kind of answered your question. Maybe someone else has an answer to that. Yeah.
I just want to say we will take 2 more questions and then wrap up the session. So just in looking at the clock, and we will still have a little bit more pause afterwards, but just so you know.
I just wanted to clarify that I'm not saying nothing. Obviously, the French Communist Party is sympathetic to during the Cold War. I just think that understanding the relationship between the French and American revolutions, both by the
which is that Marxism, but also just classic liberal thought, often understood political revolutions as they are tracked historically as following social revolutions, that society itself has changed and that the revolution as the kind of explosion of popular energy is really the act of retrofitting the state in order to accommodate the interests of society, which are kind of outgrown and facilitate and supervise. And what I want to ask is, in capitalism, where it seems as though it's difficult to make sense of what the role of the state is, not because the state doesn't correspond to the interests of society, but that the immediate interest of society might be that it has to express itself in a variety of different ways in order to continue in its present forms. What is the purpose of struggling for or perfecting the state, which is what this republicanism is about, this claim that the esoteric content of Marxism is actually the clarification of the necessary form of the state in order for political progress to occur. So maybe just to crystallize what I want to ask is, what is the purpose of thinking of the function of the state with respect to society and capitalism, and in what way does the American Revolution, however continuous it is, actually tell us anything about it? Can we go to the American Revolution in order to know what is the problem of socialism, or not socialism, but just capitalism today? Does it actually, do we access anything through it?
What I would essentially say is that that the concepts and the structures of the American Constitution and the American Revolution, as well as the broader bourgeois revolution and its political expressions, these concepts are to a certain extent still actual, right? That's the way we conceptualize capitalism still, right? Especially when there's no movement for socialism. I mean, movement for socialism would address these questions essentially, because they are the ones that these concepts are in crisis. They're still actual, but they're actual in the way that they are in crisis, that they express exactly this contradiction between the interest of society and the interest of the state, or society having to, the immediate interest of society being to, oppress itself, to preserve itself. Right? So in that sense, these categories are it's, what you might call the end of history. You don't have different concepts, it doesn't, we're...
Could you just clarify what these concepts are? Maybe just
as I said in the beginning, right, the question of the will of the people, or the will of society, the way how can we institutionalize this through the division of powers? How can we preserve the right to labor, as laid down in rights, human rights, rights of citizens, the Declaration of Human Rights in the Contract of Lisbon 2009, and the EU, for example, to refer to the EU, or the way we think about no kings, right? All of these things, of course, just relate to these very concepts, political concepts that emerged out of the bourgeois revolution. Becoming conscious about itself, and then want to address this politically, institutionally. That's. I thought. I hope this is clarifying it.
Yeah, maybe it takes us along. And that's one aspect of what I think that you mentioned as well. Also said that
What exactly has changed? Sorry.
The relation of the French and American Revolution changed
Mm.
with the Cold War, and there's still many members of the law, but it didn't still not get what like changes with the Cold War in the relation of
I mean, what changes is how the left, maybe, and not only the left, also the right conceptualizes in the 20th century during the Cold War this relation between the American Revolution and the French Revolution. They make a division. They would say, for example, the conservatives would say the American Revolution was not a revolution, because, revolution, what is that? Revolution is, Bolshevism, which is connected to Jacobinism, Bolshevist Jacobinism. And the American Revolution, the ideals of the American Revolution, it was not really a revolution. It was maybe a war of independence, but not essentially a revolution, because the concept of revolution itself maybe changes. While the leftists or Stalinists would say the American Revolution under terms of Marxism, right? In the terms that Marxism would say that the American Revolution was not a revolution. There's this division, like this iron curtain between the actual revolution advanced and the radical revolution, the radicalism of the Jacobins that ultimately failed, but then gave rise to the necessity or the Marxian revolution, right? And this is something that didn't occur, for example, to Lenin. Like Lenin, would refer back to the American Revolution as also closely connected with the whole history of bourgeois revolution as such as one revolution that came into crisis, why we have to advance it through a socialist revolution. And this is something that changed during the Cold War, where it's not anymore understood as being part of one big bourgeois revolution, but not being a revolution, or if it is, it's a reactionary one, right? So that's essentially what changes. Yeah.
Any last words? Otherwise, we can follow up this conversation in an hour for an opening panel on the French Revolution. So, first of all, thank you, Sam, and thank you, audience, for this good conversation.
Yeah, thank you for the conversation and the question.